in the mainstream media, there's been a lot of debate about, gee, households don't agree that the economy is doing so great, especially inflation. Remember that? That was a big debate during the election. And it's been going on for some time. The government indexes for inflation and for the economy, too, GDP growth, jobs, et cetera, but especially inflation, just don't coincide with the surveys that show that average households believe that inflation is much worse than being reported by the government, right? That was a big issue in the election. So I want to address that question here today. Why does the average household, there's about 120 million households in this country, why do most of whom make 100,000 or below, about 80% or so, or more, why do they feel that inflation is so much worse? Well, maybe because it is, and the government statistics don't really represent it. Well, why don't the government statistics represent it? What is it about the Consumer Price Index, and even more so the Personal Consumption Expenditures Index, which is even lower estimating inflation than the CPI? Why are they so much off track with the rest of the population feeling inflation is so much greater when the government indexes and the mainstream media that peddles them says, it's inflation's quite low here. What's going on? So I want to address that. There are 14 reasons, at least, why the government index, I'm just going to address the CPI today, why the CPI lowballs the actual inflation. 14 reasons. Now, this is a little bit technical here. So, get out your pencils and whatever, and you want to take some notes maybe to follow up on. I can only generalize, in an hour, those 14 reasons. But as a former labor economist, my task was to dig into these price indexes and understand what the assumptions and the methodologies were for estimating these price increases. Look, we're talking about statistics. What's a statistic? A statistic is a manipulation on the real raw data. That's what it is. And you make certain assumptions and you apply certain methodologies. And there's many methodologies that are used, we'll see, by the government. It's not the same methodology for all items. Certain methodologies, are questionable. And certain assumptions are very questionable that go into working with those methodologies to get the actual statistic, the CPI, for the past month or for the last year and multiple years and so forth, right? Okay, so let's talk about those 14 reasons why the CPI lowballs actual inflation. Already too much. Let's get to inflation, right? I want to talk about these 14 reasons why the inflation is not 2.6%, which is this past week's report. The Consumer Price Index indicated that inflation over the past 12 months was only 2.6% for all items, right? For core, which means core inflation, which means all items minus food and gasoline, energy, right? Minus those two big items there, food and energy, is 3.3% over the past year, right? 3.3% and 2.6%. Let's break it down and see what this actually means, right? Shelter, rents. Let's look at the report itself, right? And then we'll get to the 14 reasons. Let's look at rents. Well, shelter is 4.9% over the past year. 2/3 of the CPI index in the past year is due to shelter, rents, and mortgages. Well, now, let me take that back. Not mortgages, house prices. Okay. Services. Services are 80% of the economy in the U.S. Goods, things, right? Manufactured goods, things, items, and buildings, residences, and commercial property, whatever. Those are goods. That's about 20% of the economy. So services are the big part of the economy, and we see services have been the intractable problem of getting inflation down. We've seen significant decline in goods, particularly with regard to gasoline and energy, and also, things like clothing and appliances, goods, these things that we call goods sector, 20% of the economy. That has come down a lot from its peak, but services haven't. And services are the bigger part of the economy. Some services have abated, but still, over the past year, the services inflation is 4.8%. according to the last CPI report. And that was 5%. It's been that way, stuck chronically for 18 months. They can't get services prices down without more massive unemployment. As I said before on this show, Fed Chair Powell, back in December of 2022, said, okay, goods prices will come down, but we got to get services inflation down. And the only way we can do that is to raise unemployment in the services sector. Therefore, we're raising interest rates to precipitate a contraction or slowdown of the economy that will only then bring service prices down. Services employment has not occurred. Services unemployment has not occurred to the extent that Powell thought it would for 2 years now, almost 2 years, come December. They can't get services inflation down. It's still 4.8%. And of course, as I'm arguing now, that's a low ball. It's actually higher than that for reasons we'll talk about shortly, right? But the point is, it's chronic and it's stuck. And the other point is this latest CPI report shows that it looks like they're not going to be able to shake out more inflation in goods or services. In other words, we're at the end point of the reduction of the CPI and the inflation rate. And now we're beginning to see early signs that the CPI is starting to creep up. And so is the producer price index, which is almost all goods, beginning to creep back up. And we'll talk about what I see as the half a dozen or so main areas next year that prices will continue to rise significantly, and therefore keeping the CPI up or maybe even rising. Okay. Fed Chair Powell sees this, and he's now signaling that, maybe we don't need to cut future interest rates the way we had been. He's projected 4 cuts in interest rates next year. I think there's no way that's going to happen unless we really fall into a recession, which is possible by the middle of next year. As I've been saying, we're already in a goods sector recession, and that's why prices in goods have come down, because we're already in a goods recession. I mean, look at manufacturing PMIs, that's purchasing managers, who report slowdown in manufacturing. Look at industrial activity, economic indicators. Look at construction, new housing starts, and look at leading economic indicators, etc. All of those have been contracting. So we're in a goods recession, and of course, the recession means that goods prices have come down. But will they continue is the question. The Fed is not so sure. I think one more Fed rate cut, and that's the end of it in 2025, if inflation creeps back up, which I think it will. Now, that doesn't mean that we also won't have a deeper contraction of the real economy, a recession. You could have both. You could have chronically high inflation, prices even rising, and growing unemployment and contraction of the economy. That's called stagflation. And I think that the risk of that are rising significantly. And we'll talk about why. Anyway, the point is the Fed isn't so sure that inflation can be reduced any further. All right. Back to the report here. The takeaway is that services are stuck around 5%, as they have been chronically, right? And the big service contributor to that is rents. Well, the CPI says, rents only rose 4.8%, 4.9% last year. Anybody believe that? Well, how did it get such a low number? Well, it's because, what do you got, 50 million households rent? Somewhere around 48, 50 million households rent. Well, if you get just 1/5 of them raising their rents 10, 20, 30%, and the rest of them don't because their contracts aren't up, right? If you do that, then the average across a denominator of 50 million, for 10 million that raise it to 20, 30%, you come up with 5%. I'm just throwing, average numbers around here for descriptive purposes here. So in other words, if you look at a large number, even a significant number that raise it, then you come out with an average that's pretty low. For the people, the millions who have experienced rent increase, it's really significant, right? And there are problems with rents. But we'll talk about. Okay, government calculation of rents. If you look at the past year, gasoline prices are down 12%. Well, that's the main reason why we have a disinflation. In other words, the rate of increase in prices has slowed. Food. Okay, food prices, 1.1% over the past year, according to the latest CPI report. Does anybody believe that? That food prices at the grocery store are only up 1.1%? Well, once again, if you take thousands of items that you go to when you buy groceries, and some of them rise significantly, the most often purchased, rise significantly, but all the others do not, that aren't get purchased very much. Well, you average them out, and you only get a 1.1%. Yeah. There was the survey done, I think, earlier this year by Wall Street Journal of the most often purchased groceries, most frequently purchased. Stuff like milk and poultry and eggs and cereals and so on and so forth, right? Things that you buy mostly when you go to the grocery store. Well, according to Wall Street Journal, over the past 4 years, most frequently purchased groceries have risen 35%. 35%. And that's what households experience, right? The things they actually buy, not the things that the government says you don't buy. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why you have this big disjoint between what households say and what the government and the media and the economists who just parrot the media and the government statistics. They just parrot them. They're really disgusting, some of these mainstream economists. And then you even have so-called progressives. They just take the government data and statistics for truth. They just assume that the government is 100% correct in the assumptions and methodologies it uses to estimate inflation. They just assume that. I don't have much respect for people in the profession who do that. Anyway, that's a pet peeve. Moving on here. Auto insurance, according to the last CPI report, up 14% over the past year. Yeah, auto insurance, because auto repairs are up over 20% in the past year. Yeah, they're just passing it on. You see, insurance companies are monopolies, or what we call oligopolies, monopolistic, whatever, and they just pass on the prices. And I had a recent experience here, anecdotal piece of information. I in a parking lot, the guy backed into me, gave me a little dent in the panel on the passenger side of the car, a little dent, maybe a quarter of a half of an inch, little dent, a scratch. Went to the repair shop. To repair that, $4,000. And another one wanted $10,000. I mean, the repair companies are price gouging the hell out of us. Well, what you may not know is that your auto repair companies are not your local, in many cases, your local repair shop owned by, a guy, mechanic who started up his own business. May have a couple shops in town or whatever. No. These have been bought out by conglomerates. These are chains now. These auto repair companies are chains. They're franchises. They're like McDonald's. Yeah, and the prices are set on high by corporate, high-level corporations. That's one of the reasons why, monopolies drive up prices. That's that simple, and that's what they're doing. And then the monopoly, called the auto insurance company, just passes it on. Well, that's what's happening, and why auto repair, auto services, transportation services, whatever you want to call it, auto insurance in there, auto repair in there, transportation services, up 20%. Okay. So a big item, if you got to go, get your car repaired for some reason, you're paying through the nose for this auto insurance. The same thing for medical insurance. Airline fares are going up again. In October alone, 3.2%, 1 month, which means you're running at about a 36% annual rate. Used cars that were coming down are now jumping up in price once again. 2.7% increase in October alone, which is really a 25-30% annual rate of increase, right? So airfares, which are services, up. Auto insurance and auto repair, up. Medical services, creeping back up. And now on the good side, we got used cars starting to rise rapidly as well. And of course, rent is chronically high. And then eggs. Remember eggs, right? Food, eggs, which until this summer, over the past 4 years, had risen 113%. In other words, you're paying more than double for a dozen eggs. Okay, well, then over the summer, the price started coming down. Oh, but the price for the past year is still 30%, right? Juices, 14%, right? Okay, all those are areas. The point is, the recent CPI report shows that the disinflation, the decline in the rate of increase in prices, has pretty much hit its limit. It's not going to continue to disinflate. Services are still stuck at 5%, right? And what came down in terms of food and energy prices and some of the services are now not going down much further anymore. And you can see that in the producer price index. These are prices that businesses charge each other, and that's rising again. In the latest report just came out a few days ago, we see that. And that's mostly goods prices, by the way, and that's rising again. All right, so that's the sort of backlog that moves its way into the consumer price index. So this whole thing about the big decline in goods prices, particularly gasoline and food, is over. Unless we have a deep recession, then gasoline, energy prices probably come down further. But short of that, which is not going to happen by December, probably I would say second quarter of next year. But in the meantime, that's it, folks. And that's why Fed Chair Powell says, maybe I won't cut 4 times this year. As he said, he signaled, we don't need to assume that we're going to continue cutting interest rates next year. We don't need to assume that, right? Okay. 4 rate cuts for next year are kind of off the table. All right, so that's the recent report. That's the recent report that came out, inflation. Bottom line, looks like the disinflation is over. There are signs of goods prices creeping up and services prices still chronically high. All right. Now, why is the CPI not 2.6%? Or if you want to say core 3.3%? I've said it's definitely above that. To be safe, I say more than 4%. It's probably more than 5%. Overall. In other words, it's about 2/3 higher than it actually is. The CPI is 2/3 higher than it actually is, which puts it well over 4.5%, not 2.6%. Well, why? Well, it brings us back to my initial comments that the why is because of the assumptions and methodologies that go into calculating the CPI that keep it lowballed. All right, what are these? These are the 14 points that I talked about. Okay, what are these? Well, let's talk about rents, since rents has been over half of the increase in services CPI over the past year. What about rents? Why is rents higher than 4.8%? Well, I gave you one reason, the way you calculated it with a big denominator, et cetera. But it's also because the government, when they calculate rent prices, only looks at new leases. Yeah, only new leases. In other words, you leave your rent, and the landlord then raises the price on whoever comes in and rents the apartment again. Okay. Well, we know that rent increases occur for people who don't have new leases. They're on their own lease, their old lease, and the landlord says, "Well, I got to raise prices 10%." And then there's all these new charges, for all these other services, particularly on higher end rents. Fees of various kinds that the landlords are tacking on to the lease. Well, if you tack on fees and you leave the lease as it is, there's no change in lease. The fees don't get counted, and rent increase, right? Don't get counted. Okay, and the same thing for housing prices. Not just rents, but actual home prices, up 47% since 2019, according to the Schiller Index, right? Actually, the cost of home ownership. Well, what about home insurance rates, right? Or home utility costs, or all these other home repair costs, right? That should be part of the cost of home ownership, but it's not. It's not. Okay, so, you got a problem here on shelter. Shelter is rents and home ownership, right? There's also this problem of something that's called owner equivalent rent. What is that? Well, the government assumes that if you're a homeowner, you rent to yourself. Yeah, you rent to yourself. I mean, what an oxymoron, absurd idea that homeowners pay themselves a rent. Well, why do we have that in the rent calculation? Well, that lowers the overall estimation of rent increases because it increases the denominator. You got about 50-some million people who own their homes, just as there's like almost 50 million who actually rent. Well, if you got over 100 million, you got a bigger denominator, and any change gets moderated. Okay, but owner equivalent rent, this nonsense idea, helps keep the rent number, inflation number down, just as looking at only at new leases and not all these other fees, intra-lease, are a way of underestimating rents. And even so, the rents are 2/3 the services increase. Rents are a big problem. Rent prices. Okay, let's go to the third point. Hedonic pricing. What the heck is that? Fancy word by academics, meaning we're going to reduce the price of an item by its assumed increase in quality. Yeah, it usually has to do with lowering prices. Lowering more than what the price actually is in the marketplace. And the best example is maybe your iPhone. The government has assumed that iPhone prices, Apple reduced its prices 10% over the past year. That's what it assumes. In other words, you didn't pay more for your iPhone 16 or whatever the hell it was, right? You actually paid less because there's more quality in the phone, more features. Same thing happens with PCs, and other electronic and communication items and so forth. And that lowers the goods price in general. Hedonic pricing. You're not really paying more, even though you're paying more, you're paying less, according to the government, because of assumed quality increases. Now, conversely, the government doesn't do the opposite, assumes quality decline, and therefore adds the prices because the quality of something has declined. They only assume quality increases, reduces prices. They ignore the fact that a lot of goods that you buy, the quality is declining, and they're not making a price adjustment for that. Okay, here's a big one. Interest rates. Interest rates. Consumers do not pay for a home price every month. You're not paying for your home. You're paying for a mortgage. And a mortgage includes, especially in early years, more than the principal. You're paying in interest rates to the bank. You didn't buy a house. You bought a mortgage, you see. And what's the interest rates on mortgage? About 6 to 7%. It came down a little, going back up now, right? They were 2.5% in 2020. Now they're 6-7%. You're paying more, particularly if you have an adjustable rate or a 5-year ARM or something like that. Well, how much have mortgage rates risen since 2020? 114%. Not even 47%, 114%. Well, that is not included. The interest rate charges and the other fees are not included in the CPI. That's a biggie, If it's up 114%, that's a biggie. Well, the CPI ignores, and the PCE ignores interest charges. Now, why should it? Interest is just the price of money. It's a price. Why isn't that price included in the CPI or PCE? Good question. And it's not just mortgages. What about credit cards? Yeah, credit cards now, the balance is 1.3 trillion. Credit card rates were 15%. Now they're 23% on average. And people are carrying month to month a bigger balance on their credit cards because their wages did not keep up with inflation. So they're using their credit cards, right? We got a $1.3 trillion total credit card debt. All right. What about autos? The same thing. We got $1.6 trillion debt for auto loans now. And those rates have went up. You can still find discounts here and there, I'm sure, but still the rates have gone up over the last 4 years, so you're paying more. How about student debt? $1.8 trillion in student debt. Yeah, the rates are now 6 to 7%. More if you're a professional, going to business school or a doctor or whatever, you're paying at least 7% on that. Half of the people, by the way, are carrying over, 49% are carrying over credit card debt now. Biggest ever, So, you're looking at $17, $18 trillion in total household debt and interest rates high on it. Well, none of that is included. None of that is included in the CPI calculation, a biggie. Nor are any taxes included. Well, why? I mean, you should think of taxes as the price of government services. It's a price, too, just as the price of money is interest rates. Well, these two very important, very large items of price are excluded from the CPI. Then we get to items that are a little more specific to certain sectors here, right? Let's look at pharma. We know big pharma is raising its prices significantly. Well, it doesn't show up necessarily in calculation. Why? Because pharma has what's called formularies, right? And they just take an item that was in the lowest formulary, a generic drug or something, right? Move it into the higher formulary, where you pay more for it. The price list does not change, but because they moved it into the higher formulary, frequently used drug, whatever, it raises the price you pay for it, but it doesn't raise the price necessarily for the CPI. Right? What about tips? Tips, of course, in restaurants and so forth have risen significantly. Right, they're 18 to 25% now. You get your check at the restaurant there instead of being 10, 12, and 15 as it was. Now we start at 15, 18, 22, 25%. Well, the tips aren't reflected in the cost of food away from home. No, but you're paying more. Okay. What about waiting? Let's talk about waiting. This is important because the CPI is about 450. Most frequently purchased goods and services by households. They're given different weights in the calculation of the monthly CPI. Obviously, if more of your budget is used for food, it's going to be given a bigger weight than if it's something you buy less frequently. That's going to be given a separate weight in calculating the CPI. The problem is the weights are outmoded, and the weights really need to be adjusted. For example, gasoline. You know what the weighting factor for gasoline is? 3.2%. It's assumed you only spend 3.2% of your monthly budget on gas. Right? Shelter, 36%. Okay, that's probably pretty close of what you pay. Food, groceries at home, 8.1%. Only 8% of your budget for food? Come on. Who believes that? Right? So basically, all core prices, about 80%. Right? Prescription drugs, only 0.9% of your income is paid on prescription drugs. Now, try to explain that to somebody over 50 that's loaded up on hundreds of dollars every month, right? So the weighting is a problem. The weighting, particularly COVID, really upset the weighting ratios here, but they haven't been changed. What about this thing called base years? In other words, if you were to accurately estimate inflation, you would use the same base year for all the goods and services. But they don't do that. There are dozens of different base years which affect the actual price increase. That's a problem, right? And okay, so we can go on with that, but that's roughly the 14% that we talked about here. There's a couple others that I'll just skip here, but let me say something in closing here about what's going up next year. We got 5 minutes. Okay. Middle East war, almost certain to expand here. Look at the appointments of Trump. They're all hawks on Israel and anti-Iran, and something's going to blow in the Middle East, that's for sure. If it blows and the U.S. gets involved, they're going to start bombing Iran refineries. That's going to impact the global supply of crude oil, which is going to rise significantly, and global oil speculators, spot market speculators, are going to take advantage of that and drive it up even more. Okay, so Middle East war expanding. That's the end of declines in gasoline and energy, which has driven much of the disinflation over the past year or so. Tariffs. Trump's going to introduce tariffs. Well, this is mostly going to impact goods prices once again. And we've seen goods has been the main factor of declining CPI. Well, that could very much change dramatically with the actual tariffs. Trump has talked about 10 to 60% increase in actual tariffs. Now, there's the actual tariff increase on import prices spilling over the CPI for goods, but then there's the knock-on effect there of U.S. corporations will use the excuse of rising tariffs to price gouge even more. They always do this. They use that as an excuse. They add prices on top of it. So we're going to see more price gouging of imported goods as well as actual tariff effects on the price of those goods. So the war and tariffs will turn around, I think, the goods price declines, and we're going to see them rise again. What about services? Well, the deportation of immigration, the fear factor of jobs. We're going to see a shortage of labor in construction, in restaurants, lodging, some manufacturing, especially child care and elder care. Right now, child care cost per month ranges from $1,200 at the low end to $4,000. Well, if you got labor shortages, much of this is done, particularly elder care, by immigrants. And undocumented immigrants in particular. And that's going to cause those prices to go up for childcare and other services. Medical insurance. Well, here, let's talk about this one a little bit. This is going to go up. There's 154 million workers covered by private employer insurance. They're paying $6,300 per year, their share of the increase. Employers forecast an 8% increase in the cost of healthcare medical insurance in 2025, 5% increase in the employees' share. That means if you're paying $6,300 a year, you're going to see your health insurance costs go up $300 a month. Yeah, $300 a month. Well, that's going to be big. Right, that's going to be big. Medicare, Medicaid, co-pays and deductibles will go up. They're going to make changes in that. We hear talk about no more $7,500 credit for electric vehicles. That's going to go away. Big Pharma is going to jack up its prices now. You're paying $1,700 roughly for individual drug coverage here in terms of deductibles. That's or $2,500 if you are smaller businesses. Well, that's going to go up.